Welcome, listeners, to www.IronRadio.org, the website and podcast for all things strength sports and sports nutrition. With your hosts, Lonnie Lowery.
Remember, Phil is like a gnarled old oak tree held together with scar tissue and bone spurs.
Rob Fortney.
And I'm telling you, the pain that I would suffer was beyond excruciating.
And Phil Stevens.
Just do it, Rob. You'll kill all those nerves.
Thanks for listening. Welcome, Iron Radio listeners. This is Lonnie Lowery. I'm an exercise physiology and sports nutrition professor of about 17 years, and I'm a former competitive bodybuilder.
Hey, this is Phil Stevens. I'm an athlete, a coach. I run Strength Guild. Amongst a bunch of other things. So.
Cool. This is Dr. Mike T. Nelson, owner of Extreme Human Performance, faculty member at the Kerrig Institute, and for once in a while, I'm actually not teaching for the next couple weeks. So
nice.
It's kind of crazy.
Hey, this is Mike Ruscio. I'm a doctor and clinical researcher in Northern California.
Awesome.
Nice.
Okay. We have the usual mail and news, and then we will get to Dr. Ruscio's origin story. Let me start with this one. This is from Peter. He says, "Hi, long-time Iron Radio listener. Especially enjoyed your recent episode on fat and fitness alongside the exciting frontier of nutraceuticals. Thank you for your continued focus on evidence-based discussions. Your topic of fat and fitness led me to reach out to you today. I work in analytics for a transportation company, and I'll just leave it at that, where I build models to inform marketing activities. I'm not terribly active during the day, but I train hard in the gym 1.5 hours each weekday with steady state incline walking as cardio on weekends. I've stopped progress, and I've gotten to an unhappy overweight state, including halted lifting progress. I have come to trust your judgment and approach over the years, and I would appreciate your guidance. Please let me know your availability if you are. Thank you again, Peter." All right, I'm going to offer my 2 cents, and anybody else, of course, can chime in. But if you are stagnant, one of the things you might want to consider, I would suggest, would be progression models, right? I mean, if you've adapted to your current challenge and you need different forms of stimulus, of overload, there's lots of ways you can do that. There's what I call the anatomical approach, like bodybuilders do, like a 3-way body part split or something like that. There's a movement-based approach, again, my words, but that's where powerlifters, they focus more on movement, right? Instead of having a day for chest and triceps, for example, you have bench day. It's more movement-focused. There's all kinds of periodization type things, like a mesocycle, for the next 12 weeks. Focus on a more specific goal. Like whether it's muscle gain or strength and that sort of thing. And then maybe build different mesocycles in the future toward other things, right? From a cardio perspective, you could add variety. I mean, it's amazing to me how similar diet and training are in so many ways. And variety is important. So if you're healthy enough to do it and the doctor says it's fine, some high-intensity interval training maybe instead of just the steady-state cardio that you do. Build a little mitochondria density, something like that. But I think that's kind of where you are, Peter, these sort of starting to entertain progression models or bring in some novel stimulus. I don't know. Phil, what do you think?
It's just hard to answer without knowing. Like, it's hard to tell him what he needs to change without knowing what he's doing.
Yeah.
I know he's going in an hour and a half, 5 days a week, it sounds like. But what are you doing in an hour and a half, 5 days a week? I mean, that's plenty of time.
Yeah. Oh, yeah.
I wouldn't say you need to go to 2 hours. I wouldn't go there, most likely. But I mean, yeah, you need to. You have likely, like you said, just adapted totally to what you're doing, and are you going in and just doing the same thing over and over, expecting to keep progressing? Then probably not. Mm-hmm. I mean, maybe it's time to seek professional help. As far as that goes, you're a busy person. You've got other things going on in your life. Let somebody else think about that for you.
Mm-hmm.
So
I think that was actually the point of the email. He was sort of reaching out in that way. So,
gotcha.
Insights from you, Mike?
Yeah, I agree with all that. Again, we're just kind of guessing here a little bit. I agree with Phil too that, if you're that busy and you've got a bunch of other stuff going on, then, let someone else handle it. We can get back to them. Both of us do that kind of stuff too. one thing to consider, again, depending on what he's doing, he may consider dropping his lifting sessions to an hour and just doing like a half-hour fasted walk in the morning, just to get some daylight exposure, get some movement, get outside. Sounds like he's inside a lot of time. He's at a desk due to a lot of his job. I would look at, if he's got like any type of watch, to look at how many steps he's getting per day. I usually find with people work inside, it's pretty easy to get a low number of steps and not realize it. And a lot of them I've seen do, pretty, more intense stuff at the gym, and then they can't figure out why they're not making progress. So just overall movement. If you look at their day, you've got not much. Ooh, this massive spike right before they try to go to bed. Mm-hmm. So sometimes changing the pattern around a little bit. And then one thing you can probably do on his own too, from a nutrition side, even just on his own, just run a simple 3-day nutrition log. Just, write down everything you eat and drink, not necessarily looking at it to make massive changes, but more or less just looking at it for that increased awareness. And it still boggles my mind how often I do that with people who are like, my diet's just really good. It's really good. I'm like, all right, just, fill this out. Let me know where we're at. We'll, see if we need to make any changes. Maybe we don't. In the back of my head, I'm going, we're probably need to change some stuff. Every single time they come back, they're like, oh, I didn't really know I was eating that many cupcakes or this or that, or, or there's some excuse of, I went out for friends, 3 days during the week or whatever. So just do that just for a simple level of awareness too.
Yeah. I mean, the classic thing, of course, get some kind of baseline assessment, whether it's nutrition or exercise, some kind of assessments, and then do monitoring periodically, right? You sort of think like a scientist and monitor the small changes towards an outcome, So
I think you guys have a pretty good rundown on that there. I'll let the strong guys comment on this, and the nerdy guys like me will just take a back seat until we get into the nerdy topic of gut health.
Well, I am not that strong, so
we're all nerds too.
Yeah. Okay. Let's quickly just go. There are two very brief news tidbits.
Strength and muscle sport news.
The first one, this is from the Institute of Food Technologists. Mike and I are members of that group. They have a nice wellness newsletter that I talk about every once in a while. This first one, the title here is 90% of consumers believe food companies are responsible for healthy diets. In a survey of more than 1,000 people worldwide, 9 out of 10 consumers responded that they believe food companies have the responsibility to make sure their diet is healthy.
Wow.
52% of consumers said they had a lot, and 37% said they had some intention that or belief that the food companies are responsible. Only 9% of consumers thought food and drink companies had no responsibility for healthy diets, providing healthy diets. Consumers in Asia were more likely to place the burden of responsibility on the food company. That's interesting.
Wow.
However, the survey also revealed that levels of trust in the food industry are really pretty low when it comes to health and nutrition. So think about the irony here. I'm already thinking they're demanding, they're placing responsibility on the food company that they distrust.
Yeah.
It says globally, doctors and other healthcare professionals were the most trusted sources of health and nutrition information. After doctors, respondents trusted the government and other health authorities next, and then friends and family, which about 15% felt was the most important. It says food and beverage companies came in very low on the list. Only 5% of people put food and beverage companies at the top of trust, right? So, I don't know. To me, I already start thinking about what about the dietary supplement world? Like, if we distrust the food companies, do we distrust the dietary supplement companies even more? That kind of thing. And again, so it says, our research makes clear the scale of the challenge facing the food industry, says Richard Clark, who is a director of ingredient communications. On one hand, consumers expect food and drink manufacturers, to have a commitment to health. And on the other, many people distrust the very information that they provide. So that
just sounds like a bunch of people who don't want any personal responsibility for anything.
Yeah, worldwide survey.
Probably pretty accurate, sadly.
That's one of those, like I'd have to ask my wife what the exact term is. One of those cognitive conflicts, right? You can't. On one side you want this, and on the other side, it's not rational. Anyway, the next one will probably interest our guest. It's about the nutraceutical properties of starches. So it starts by saying starch digestibility is associated with the glycemic index, for example. There was a recent article published in the Journal of Food Science that explores the structure and the nutraceutical properties of resistant starch and slowly digestible starch. So decades ago, right, it was found that there is a fraction of starch that's not digested in the small intestine. It goes on to the large intestine where it's fermented by the microbiota. And that fraction was named resistant starch. This article also goes on to talk about the fraction that is slowly digested, causing a very slow, sustained release of blood glucose. And that's called slowly digestible starch. So this whole thing, and remember, this is from the food technologist, and Mike and I know these guys are very interested in essentially the attractiveness of a food product in sales. It's not just about health. But it says the slowly digestible starch and resistant starch have been widely studied. The interest now for the food industry is increasingly on using them as substrate for the selective growth of prebiotic-influenced bacteria such as lactobacilli, bifidobacteria, etc. Here's a quote toward the end of this piece. It says, the current challenge for the food industry is to develop new technologies or methods to obtain heat-stable SDS or RS, right, slowly digestible or resistant starches, and structures that can resist the changes during food preparation, right, presumably so we can get the benefits out of it. So,
I think there's some interesting stuff, in regards to that paper, and you're seeing some of this research being published trying to use resistant starch or perhaps SDS as a substitute for sugars, and something that can be used as a filler that maybe has a little bit of a sweet taste to it, or at least can be used as a filler that may also have some health benefit, because it can probably most notably lower blood sugar. The best research for things like resistant starch and or their cousin, which would be considered prebiotics kind of at large, would be the ability to lower blood sugar. Second to that would be the ability to aid in constipation. However, the main problem you run into is as the dose of these things increases, their effectiveness also increases. However, the incidence of gastrointestinal side effects increases also. And that's the major ceiling they're going to probably bump up against, is to get a benefit. They're probably going to have I would estimate around 20, maybe even as high as 30% of consumers complaining about gastrointestinal symptoms, because if you look at the IBS population, if you are a little bit more loose in your definition of IBS and you're giving the most judicious, or I'm sorry, if you're giving the most liberal kind of estimation on the prevalence of IBS, it may be as high as about 30%, and that's a little bit generous, but
wow.
But if you factor in with that functional gastrointestinal disorders, which are similar to IBS but don't fit the IBS diagnostic criteria, then you're definitely getting more proximal 30%. And it's that subgroup of people that have the highest risk for negative reactions from things like resistant starch and prebiotics. And so that's why I say they may see about 30% of their consumer base having some negative impacts. I don't think it's a bad idea necessarily. I try to look at these things from a more balanced perspective, and sometimes you get this excitement about resistant starch could be healthy, and let's just load all these processed foods up with resistant starch. Well, don't forget that people with IBS and IBD, actually, inflammatory bowel disease, ulcerative colitis, Crohn's, because they're a subset of patients that may have negative reactions to this. So you may solve one problem, increase or improving the glycemic index of the food, so to speak, but you may create another problem, increasing the likelihood someone's going to be running to the bathroom after eating it. So it's a balancing act.
Yeah, this is reminiscent to me of the medium chain triglyceride thing, where they were trying to give people enough for performance enhancement, and they ran up against about a 20-gram ceiling. Not just in people who are prone, but in almost everybody. And if only we could get that performance-enhancing dose in there. But, yeah, as far as tolerance goes and the onset of diarrhea, it was just very difficult to, at least for that goal, yeah.
Right.
Yeah. And you can use C8 oil a little bit, and it kind of gets around that a little bit. But again, you're still going to run up to that threshold. And it's not as bad as, like, I'm sure everybody remembers the Olestra potato chips that,
Oh yeah.
yeah.
The leakage.
Let's,
the leakage,
Yeah.
let's make a fat that's not processed like a fat. Okay. There'll be no downside of that.
Yeah. Yeah. Oops. Anal leakage. That doesn't sound right at all. You know?
Yeah. Yeah. Makes for a nice warning on your package.
Right. That's attractive. That'll increase sales.
Cool. So we're on here today with my buddy Dr. Michael Ruscio, who actually was the guy that I seeked out once I destroyed myself after my PhD. So he helped put me back together, which I greatly appreciate. So to give us a background kind of on your origin story and how you got into kind of focusing on gut health.
Yeah, well, thanks for having me on, guys. And the kind of short-ish version of the story is when I was in college, I was on track to go into conventional medicine. I was your typical, type A, overachieving college student. I also was a college athlete playing lacrosse. Always had a lot of energy. Always felt generally very, very good. And all of a sudden, I started having fatigue, depression, insomnia, bouts of brain fog. The feeling of being cold, and from a guy who always felt damn near close to invincible, this was a pretty sharp contrast. So I figured, well, this is the field I'm going into. This must be what doctors are for. Let me go see a few doctors. And I saw an internist, a generalist, and an endocrinologist, and they all said, yeah, you're super healthy. You have a good body composition. You're fit. There's nothing wrong with you. And I would come back to, well, did you catch the story I gave you when I walked in, essentially saying that I feel pretty terrible right now? And you get some of these well-intentioned but non-meaningful answers. Oh, perhaps it's stress. Maybe your academic load is too high, blah, 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 blah. And so long story short, it wasn't until I found a doctor that practiced functional medicine, which is, we kind of say, a subset of complementary and alternative medicine, who thought I may have had an intestinal infection. And that actually ended up being true. We did a stool test, and via the gold standard for detecting these kind of things, which is stool antigen recognition, where a microbiologist looks at your poop under a microscope, which is a really fun job, I would imagine.
Good times all day.
Yeah, they found amoeba histolytica, which is not a very common infection to find in people. It's actually somewhat rare, but it can be very damaging to the intestines. And it was actually that infection that was causing all my symptoms. Now, unbeknownst to me, before I had figured this out, I had spent months doing internet research, thinking that I had hypothyroid, adrenal fatigue, heavy metal toxicity, all these things that you read about on the internet. And I tried all these protocols, and I wasted quite a bit of time and money chasing down symptoms, only to figure out that I missed a major root cause issue in the gut, and it wasn't until I addressed that issue that all my other symptoms improved. And what was notable was I didn't really have any digestive symptoms, and this is what can throw some people. But there's certainly a subset of people who have pretty screwed up guts, for lack of a more scientific term, but the gut problem does not manifest as gut symptoms. It solely manifests as lesions on the skin, as depression, as insomnia, as fatigue. And so it's something that can throw people pretty easily. But after that experience, I wanted to go into the same route of CAM medicine as the doctor that treated me, and that's what I've been doing now. And as I've been practicing in the world of complementary and alternative medicine, I've been noticing that there is a ton of excess. And there's also a lot of very well-intentioned people, and there's also a lot of great work. But unfortunately, you have like a 50-50 ratio of people that are doing great work compared to people who are trying to do great work, and I think have the best intentions, but don't realize that there is little scientific validity to many of the tests and the treatments that they're doing, which is why people are leaving their offices after doing $3,000, $4,000, $5,000 worth of testing, and you could do $800 worth of testing and get the same results as we do in my clinic. And you just have to know how to use science to learn rather than to footnote your pre-existing opinion, and be a bit conservative and a bit practical. And you can actually get people very healthy without having to be excessive. And so this is spawned into my second passion in the field, which is helping people with this kind of integrative model, but also trying to do it cost effectively and non-overzealously. And to that endpoint, we've been doing some clinical research at my office, trying to study these things, various things in the gut, and trying to really help move the field forward to being able to help people, which the field of complementary and alternative medicine certainly can, but not having to turn someone into a health fanatic in order to get those results. So that's kind of the long short of my story.
Cool. Oh, that's very cool. And have you found that this gets a little bit in the topic today, but I'll ask you one question, then we'll move on to that after our break. Do you find that a lot of, like you mentioned, well-intentioned, more functional medicine people just get enamored with testing everything under the sun just because you can, regardless of how more stable or the background of certain tests are? Because it always seems like whatever the newest test is like kind of the latest and greatest and sexiest thing. And I can imagine clients poking around on the interwebs come in almost probably requesting those things because they seem kind of new and sexy, and I don't want that boring basic stuff that has more data behind it.
100%, absolutely. And I would say I probably spend about 30% of my time in the clinic trying to talk a patient out of a disease they think they have or a test they think that they need. And fortunately now I've built up enough of a reputation where people kind of seek me out as their filter, and they'll say, I read about this test. I know that you're pretty evidence-based and you're conservative, so I wanted to bounce it off you. So it's not so much something that I have to talk someone out of the marketing that they've fallen into on their, during their internet reading. But it is a problem, and it's certainly, new and novel tends to be thought of as being better, and it's a fundamental problem that inflicts some of functional medicine, which is more testing and more treatment equals better results. And I've been saying for a few years now, I think that's actually the opposite of what's true. If for no other reason, because if you're doing too much testing, you can distract yourself from identifying what the true important factors are. And if you're trying to treat 6 different lab tests at the same time, it can be very hard to sort out what's helping and what's not helping, and you can confuse your way out of being able to figure out the problem because you've added meaningless information into what's already a fairly variable rich problem, which is trying to fix a human being. If you introduce into that a few tests that have no scientific validity, you're now treating nothing, right? You're distracting your brain. You're distracting your ability to figure out what's inflicting someone with these meaningless tests. And so the more meaningless tests that you introduce into the process, you make it much harder as a clinician to solve the problem. Because think about it, if you're trying to solve a math equation, but someone threw in 4 random numbers into the equation that meant nothing, how able would you be able to solve the equation, right? You need to have accurate data to move on. And so, yeah, I think it's one of the main problems is that there's this illusion that more testing equals better results, and I would argue it's actually the opposite.
Yeah, I think that follows Occam's razor, right? Simplest explanation is probably the right one, especially when, like you said, it's not just useless information, but it could just be invalid, distracting, invalid stuff. Personal story, but I had a family member who was struggling a little bit with gastrointestinal symptoms. Still haven't been figured out, actually, but as part of what the doctor was doing, just test after test after test, including things like, it might be pancreatic insufficiency. Here, let's try these pills for a while, so we had some, lipase, amylase, stuff like that. But you're talking about, thank God that we have reasonable insurance, but $2,000 for a month's worth of these pancreatic enzymes. And I'm like, wow. Just to kind of play with, let's try this and let's try this. And I'm like, well, you're kind of playing on my financial back here, right?
Right.
Like just to satisfy your curiosity. And so can we use a little bit more targeted logic here instead of just randomly ruling stuff out? Maybe there's an element that has to be done like that, but that was frustrating for us.
There is. I mean, there's definitely, I think, a valid element to just traditional kind of empiric medicine. Let's see how this treatment works, because sometimes the treatment is really the test. But if you can codify that into a efficient sequence of steps, then you can help prevent waste. And for example, I would always look to someone having a bacterial overgrowth before giving them something like bile or pancreatic enzymes, especially because something like a bacterial overgrowth in the intestines can actually deconjugate or deactivate the ability of bile, which is one of the pancreatic secretions, liver pancreas secretions, but to function. So sometimes if you know how to function through these the right way, something may look like malabsorption secondary to a lack of pancreatic enzyme or bile secretion, but it's actually a bacterial overgrowth that's essentially breaking down these enzymes. And if you then treat the bacterial overgrowth, the enzyme function normalizes itself. So you're right, but also if you can organize these things appropriately, then you can be much more efficient. And the reason why I put the bacterial overgrowth firstly is because it's much more common than something like exocrine pancreatic insufficiency. So yeah, I totally see where you're coming from.
Very cool. Well, let's take a short break here, and then we'll get into the topic of the day, which we're kind of drifting that way, which is gut health and lifters.
Hey listeners, this is Dr. Lonnie Lowry. If you've ever had anyone critique you on your protein intake as part of your weightlifting lifestyle, oh, you poor meathead, all that extra protein is going to rot your kidneys or weaken your bones or dehydrate you or give you gout or who knows what. There is a book available. You could simply Google CRC Press and Lowry. And what I've done is reach out to experts all over the world and create a book, a single compendium that you can hold up and say, this is why I consume extra protein. This can be very valuable when you're being quote-unquote educated by various professionals on the topic. There's an enormous amount of literature in this book on the safety, the effectiveness, how protein works in cells, the history of protein and weight trainers, much more. So again, please check out CRC Press and Protein and Lowry. You can just Google that, and I do, full disclosure, I do make a small single-digit royalty on the book, but that's not why I did it. I did it so we can all have something, our particular population, to both defend what we do and to inform our nutrition and our eating. Thanks. IronRadio is, of course, primarily a podcast. But over the years, there have been technical glitches calling for backup streaming and listeners who wanted the convenience of other sources of audio content. Toward this end, IronRadio is now simulcast and backed up on YouTube. If needed, please search Lawnman07 or IronRadio from within YouTube. There's not much video, but if you like to listen through YouTube on a Roku or other living room device, there you go.
Like your weekly fix of Iron Radio? In addition to being a popular institute on iTunes, we are also on email. Simply go to www.ironradio.org and sign up for the voluntary email. You'll get a once per week email, no more, that's little more than the show notes and a link to the audio. So go for it.
Hey, welcome back to Iron Radio. It's Dr. Mike T. Nelson, Dr. Lonnie Lowry, Coach Phil Stevens, and today we have our special guest, Dr. Michael Ruscio. And today's topic of the day is talking about gut health in lifters. And well, I guess one of the things I wanted to start off with, which you talked a little bit about right before this, is for people that specifically are more on the exercising end of the spectrum. Any idea about how often you would suspect there may be some gut issues? Because, man, if anyone's been around like the Arnold or stuck on a plane flying to Columbus that time of the year, I don't recommend being anywhere close to the bathroom. It's not a fun experience. And just in my own experience with people who are already doing some type of exercise, it anecdotally appears like people have more, kind of digestion issues and things of that nature. But again, that may just be because people have some issue and they're already, seeking somebody out. So any thoughts on that, just in terms of just general prevalence? And I know that's a very wide topic.
Right, and it is. We might be able to kind of extrapolate from looking at the prevalence of IBS in the population, which is, depending on what population you look at worldwide compared to the United States, you're somewhere between about 15 to maybe 22%, according to various estimates. And I would be inclined to think that that's higher in people who exercise for a couple of reasons. One, if people are overtraining, that can, in my opinion, clearly increase one's risk for having maybe not traditionally diagnosed IBS in terms of you check all of the diagnostic criteria for the IBS box, but you clearly have symptoms like gas, bloating, loose stools, diarrhea, constipation, what have you. So overtraining can do that. And also, some of the supplements that are used are fairly high in compounds that can be or higher in compounds that can be noxious or irritating to the gut. So if you combine those two things, and then also sometimes the people who have the highest affinity for exercise may be cutting out an hour of sleep to get up an hour earlier and get in their exercise. So now you have maybe not enough sleep, some additional stress from exercise. You combine that with a pre and post workout drink that may have irritating colors, fillers, or prebiotics in it. You kind of create this perfect storm for people doing a number on their guts. And it's definitely a subset of people that I see where, maybe a few times a month you see someone who's otherwise very healthy, and it appears that they just exercise their way into some pretty progressed gut symptoms, and we have to do some work to kind of unpeel that. So I would say it's definitely increased. How much above the general population is really hard to say, but it's definitely something that I've noticed in the clinic.
Gotcha. Is there any type of, for listeners here, are there any type of symptoms or things that they should kind of keep in mind that, I've kind of got this, and this, maybe I should go, seek out a functional med or physician and kind of get it checked out?
Well, there's certainly your classic digestive symptoms. So if people have, and I guess I should maybe step back and say, if these things happen on rare occasion, I wouldn't worry about it. If you ate out and had some spicy food, I wouldn't worry about it, right? So if these things are anomalies, I wouldn't sweat it. But if these things are happening habitually, then it may be something to get checked for. Things like abdominal pain, reflux or GERD or indigestion, constipation or swinging the other way, looser stools and diarrhea, or potentially an oscillation between the two, bowel urgency, the feeling of bloating. These are all indicators that there could be something underlying that needs to be investigated. So those are some of the easiest. Where it gets a little more difficult to kind of connect the dots on is sometimes people, and this has been documented most notably for celiac disease, but there's also some documentation potentially for non-celiac gluten sensitivity, and even for things like bacterial overgrowth. They may only manifest as non-digestive symptoms. So sometimes these things only manifest as joint pain, for example, or as skin lesions, or even something neurological like restless leg. So it's not to say that the gut is a cure-all, but certainly someone could be devoid of gut symptoms and having some of these other non-gut problems, which is one of the reasons why I'm so passionate about gut health, because it can manifest in such a wide array of symptoms, and then when you correct a problem in the gut, it can alleviate such a wide array of symptoms also.
Dr. Ruscio,
cool.
If I can ask, so because of what you're talking about, in fact, I'm very guilty of the overlooking infectious disease, when it comes to like symptoms like that, like I deal with some of what you just said, joint pain, restless legs, things like that. Is it possible for the physician to do the wrong, like microbiological test, like they send it to Path Lab? Do they do this huge suite of possible offenders, or could they miss that in some way? Does that make sense?
Yeah, it's a great question actually, and it can be missed, and I think it can be missed equally on both ends of the spectrum. Your conventional doctor will oftentimes just look for the most strict pathogens, I guess you could say, things that can cause, serious infections like amoebas, and this is something that would be tested by your typical kind of ova and parasite. So they'll look for amoebas, protozoas, things like Giardia, Cryptosporidium, things like this, maybe Campylobacter, and that's on the one hand. Then on the other hand, there are alternative doctors that may not do a great job with that per se, and they may get distracted in some of the, into your guy's earlier point, the newer and novel tests, which can map out every bacteria in the entire world of bacteria in your gut. And unfortunately, these tests are clinically useless, yet it doesn't stop the fact that they're marketed as being clinically useful, not by the people at the top of the scientific food chain. They're pretty clear in saying these tests are preclinical. It doesn't stop people from using these or trying to use these in a clinical application, unfortunately. So at those two extreme endpoints, you can miss some simple things, and something that's probably the most common out of all of these is not actually an infection. It's actually an overgrowth of your resident bacteria, and this is known as small intestinal bacterial overgrowth. Not to say that this is the only thing to worry about, but it's in my observation the most common thing that comes back positive, and this is where the bacteria that naturally reside in your intestinal tract just overgrow. So it's not a strict pathogen. It's not necessarily considered an infection. It's just an overgrowth. And so this is something that can elude testing, because this can only be tested via a breath test. And so if you go and you do a 3 or 4 poop sample at something like LabCorp or Quest, I do think that those labs have good testing, but this is not part of that test. So it could be missed there. And then on the other end of the spectrum, going back to more of a alternative doctor, doing a mapping of your microbiota where you get a assessment of the entire world of bacteria, that also won't tell you if you have something like small intestinal bacterial overgrowth. So yes, these things can be missed. It's not to say that you're missing a serious infection per se, but they can be simple imbalances that can have pretty profound effects.
Well, not that we want people to self-treat, but what could listeners potentially at least consider if they wanted to prevent something like small intestine bacterial overgrowth? Like, are there things that lead to it, or is it the kind of thing it's almost random and it just needs to be diagnosed and then treated, right?
Well, there are things that can increase the chances of small intestinal bacterial overgrowth. Maybe the most notably is the use of acid-suppressing medication, although that hasn't been fully bore out by the literature, but it does seem there is at least a small increase of risk for when someone is using long-term acid-suppressing medication, things like Nexium or Prilosec. And interestingly, there was actually one study performed in about 1,800 patients, and this center wanted to assess what factors put someone at the highest risk for SIBO. And they were looking at things like the use of acid-lowering medications, the use of immunosuppressive drugs, prior intestinal surgery. And out of all these things, interestingly, they found that the two most associated factors, the two most predictive factors for having small intestinal bacterial overgrowth were actually being hypothyroid and not being treated, or ironically, what you were even at higher risk for was if you were hypothyroid, but you were now being treated and on thyroid medication. So there may be, and I'm not saying to stop taking thyroid medication if you're taking it, but what this may tell us is there's something unique to thyroid disease independent of thyroid hormone levels that increases the risk for small intestinal bacterial overgrowth. Because there was also an association found for those with hyperthyroidism, meaning they had too high of a level of thyroid hormone. So it may be something independent, and we can talk about the mechanism if you want in a moment, but there may be something independent of thyroid hormone levels that's unique to thyroid disease that increases the risk for this. So there are some simple things there. Also, if people have had food poisoning, that can increase the risk that they may develop this after the bout of food poisoning. I wouldn't necessarily say there's much you can do to prevent food poisoning, although some people, some gastroenterologists recommend taking antibiotics prophylactically when you travel to things like third world countries or places without good hygiene, and that's been criticized. I don't necessarily think that that's needed to be done, but that's one recommendation that floats around out there. But I would say simply that focusing on a healthy diet, healthy lifestyle, clean food, and trying to mitigate the use of medications that are either immunosuppressive or acid suppressing would be a great place to start in terms of prevention. And if someone's displaying symptoms, then just go to work on fixing the problem, and it shouldn't be too big of a deal going forward.
Gotcha.
Cool. Yeah, so you're talking about food and lifestyle and everything there too. And I was going to ask this to Phil. We had just a short conversation on this, and then Lonnie, and I'll get your opinion, Dr. Ruscio, about probiotics, since they seem to be popular now, and every new food, every time I go to the store, it includes some type of strain of probiotics. But a lot of those foods have been around for a long time, and I know you recently, Phil, said you've been doing all sorts of fermented stuff there. How did that start, and how's your fermented experiment going?
No, it's going good. Well, we've been making yogurt for years at home, and that was, I think part of that was just we realized you can make a gallon of yogurt for like the price of a gallon of milk instead of buying a quart for more than the price of a gallon of milk. So, and we have a local lady that we get our dairy from and stuff like that, so we're able to kind of source our own milk and everything. But no, and then that moved on to doing kefir, and then recently, about a month ago, we started making kombucha. And it's just my wife researches this stuff a lot, and it's just doing anything we can to potentially increase our health, and that was an easy way to do it. And the benefits seemed worth the while, and it's actually it's painless. Basically you put your this is what they call a SCOBY in your container and let it sit, and do its job. So no, I mean, it's good. I can't tell you like right now that I've seen any like life-changing benefits, but I feel good, and yeah, I mean, so. And
you found a limit to how much kombucha you can drink.
Well, yeah, and I was warned from that from the guy I got it from. Like, don't go crazy on this stuff, because you'll have it'll backlash on you. We go through a gallon a week for a family of 4.
Okay.
So yeah, and then it's tasty. I mean, you throw some fruit in there, and you can flavor it, and it kind of makes it effervescent, if you will, bubbly. So that, and we're a pretty health conscious family, though. I mean, we source kind of as much food as we can locally and things like that. So
very cool. I just got a kit to finally start doing some kombucha coming up pretty soon. Do you use much for probiotics or probiotics foods, Lonnie?
Not really, actually. I mean, I eat copious amounts of fruits and vegetables, variety of dairy products, things like that. I sort of along the lines of what Dr. Ruscio was saying. I just sort of, I have a pretty whole food type diet, and I train, and that's about it, really. I mean, there's, like you said, so many foods have probiotics. Last year, I remember at the ISSN meeting, there was a company even selling, right, the probiotic coffee that has some type of heat-resistant spore.
Stable.
Yeah. I'm not opposed to any of that, but I've always been curious after just listening to interviews on Science Friday and things like that over the years. It seems to me, and maybe Dr. Ruscio can add to my knowledge base on this, I'd love it, but you don't rewrite your gut bacterium in the way that, or the profile of bacteria in your gut in the way that a lot of people think you do. You're just encouraging the growth of different subsets of bacteria. And I'm always curious as to how much, right? How much impact can I have in rewriting this, blueprint, if you will?
Yeah, that's actually a great question, and it's one that unfortunately there's a lot of confusion, and I guess any time a topic comes into vogue, you have more confusion because there's just more people talking about it, and of course it's easier to have people talking about inaccurate talking points, and then confusion naturally grows from there. But you're right. You can't rewrite your bacteria, with the exception of if you undergo a procedure known as a fecal microbiota transplant therapy. Outside of, and that's fairly invasive. You essentially take stool from a healthy donor and administer that, oftentimes sort of like via an enema, to a sick host, and they retain that stool for a while in their colon, and that actually can change. It can actually kind of retransplant the healthy donor microbiota into the recipient. But with probiotics, it's a misconception that probiotics colonize you. Most probiotics do not colonize you, and that's been fairly well bore out by the research literature. But they do have positive benefits, ironically, probably more so antibacterial and antifungus than probacterial. And this actually may be a good thing. And the reason why probiotics may be beneficial amongst a few others may be because they come in and they crowd out and they kill off overgrowths of bacteria and overgrowths of fungus, which then allow the other bacteria that may be dwindling underneath the pressure of these overgrowths a chance to reestablish a foothold, and it allows a colony to rebalance itself. So you can't use probiotics, it's a common misconception to reseed, as it's sometimes said on the internet, but they can clearly have a benefit because they may help knock down these imbalances that have been kind of choking out your healthy bacteria. And once those imbalances are gone, the healthy bacteria can flourish, and this sets up the ecosystem for a healthier equilibrium in the longer term.
You know, Phil, you once mentioned that this has been taken to the extent that there's fecal doping. Weren't you the one who mentioned that a few weeks ago? Like they identified
the article. There's that. I don't have it in front of me, so I won't get it right. But there was some bacteria that existed only in like elite level athletes and elite. They were looking mainly at elite cyclists, and so these cyclists were starting to, or lower level cyclists were starting to fecal dope with these elite level cyclists, and they were like less aches and pains, better recovery, this and that, by getting this flora from the elite level cyclist.
Wow.
It sorted into their,
right. That's the scary part. Like if this is like doping, non-medical, almost like underground
this
stuff.
Lady did it in like a hotel bathroom.
Right. Like how do you? I don't want to see this. I don't want to even imagine this.
Yeah. So.
There's something interesting there that I think is noteworthy. One, I would highly discourage anyone from doing a non-supervised FMT. Now there is maybe a case to be made, to be perfectly honest, for someone that's got something like severe ulcerative colitis or Crohn's, and they're up against the wall of have a section of your intestines cut out, or try this FMT at home because it's not sanctioned in the States for inflammatory bowel disease. Okay, you can make a case there, right? But for Samantha Smith, who's looking to lose that last 4.5 pounds, this would be a terrible decision in my case. And there have been adverse events reported from FMT, including death. Now, this isn't a small subset, but adverse events have been reported. It's also, I think, important to mention that your fitness and your health partially dictates your intestinal microbiota. So when we see healthy people have healthier intestinal bacteria, it may actually be the health of the host that's dictating the health of the bacteria. And it's a very common misconception that if you can just focus on changing the bacteria the way that you want to, then those bacterial changes will cause improved health in the host. And that's not generally true. It's really unfortunate. And maybe one of the best examples of this is when we come back to looking at the models of irritable bowel syndrome, IBS, and inflammatory bowel disease, IBD. When patients undergo, and this is based upon numerous clinical trials, but you essentially see this trend where things that feed bacteria tend to have a much higher rate of causing negative side effects in these patients compared to therapies that actually reduce bacteria. And so this is why when you look at things like prebiotics and fiber in patients with IBS and IBD, they're more prone. They can help in some cases, but there's a higher chance of having a negative effect. However, when you look at things like a low FODMAP diet or probiotics, which can be antibacterial, as we discussed a moment ago, or even things like antimicrobial therapies, those have the highest success rate. So there's a major flaw in this thinking that if you can just change your gut bacteria, it's going to cause a beneficial effect to the host, especially when you look at many of the clinical interventions that are antibacterial actually have a greater impact than these therapies that are probacterial. And then when you also look at that in the context of, we know that exercise as one parameter has a health it improves the microbiota in a healthy way. And there's been a few studies that have looked at this, looking at rugby players compared to age and sex matched cohorts who were not athletes. They had healthier microbiotas. Another study found that cardiorespiratory fitness was a predictor of quote-unquote health of the microbiota. And even more recent studies showing that when someone transitions from being sedentary to exercising, that actually improves their microbiota. And when we add to that the fact that when you take children who are type 1 diabetics who don't produce insulin and you put them on insulin, their microbiota improves. We start seeing this factor that the world of bacteria in your gut, as important as they are from a guy who's a gut specialist, you also have to have a healthy respect for knowing if it's a cause or if it's an association. And there are things that we know are damaging, like small intestinal bacterial overgrowth, H. pylori infections, candida or yeast overgrowth, that these need to be treated. But there's also a world of things that you can do to improve the health of the host that then improves the microbiota. And this is important to mention because we sometimes forget that the bacteria are existing in an environment. And if the environment is unhealthy, aka the host, then the bacteria are going to be unhealthy. So I just want to throw that in there as kind of the voice of reason, because as you denoted, some people are really getting very left-winged with some of this stuff, and they may do unintended harm.
Yeah, two-way street, right? It sounds like when it comes to host and the bacteria,
Right.
Yeah, because that's kind of my general thought, and correct me if this is not the best approach, but unless someone comes to me who has, just really frank stuff that's more like on a disease, obviously I'm going to refer them out at that point. But they have stuff that's kind of, borderline. I usually tell them, I'm like, well, let's do some stuff related to exercise, nutrition, and lifestyle for, at least 3 months. And let's, make sure your compliance is good. And then let's just see what the changes are, right? I'm not dealing with anything that's a life-threatening illness per se. They've already been cleared by their physician. And it's pretty amazing to me how a lot of times, not every time, but a lot of times, everything just seems to get better. Going for a walk in the morning, do some breathing stuff, get your breathing to work better, maybe do some meditation, do some exercise, eat better food. And I think a lot of times we tend to just forget how much that all of it is related. And I think a lot of people are kind of wanting to look for the quick fix at the same time, too.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I agree. And I also think, unfortunately, enough people have been fed this story that this super in-depth alternative medicine lab testing can tell you exactly what you need to do to get healthy, only to figure out that, geez, I ended up going on a elimination diet, taking vitamin D, fish oil, and a probiotic, but it took $3,000 worth of lab testing to figure that out, right? So, and there's a time and a place for lab testing, but yeah, I think we've all been fed a bit of a line of BS, thinking that there's this, unique, we can pinpoint exactly what you need to do based upon your genetics and based upon this advanced lab testing. And if you look at much of the clinical literature, honestly and objectively, you see that promise falls short far more often than it actually delivers.
Yeah, and it's pretty rare that I ever see someone who has some type of gut issue whose HRV or stress levels or breathing is just not completely out of whack. And again, the flip side doesn't mean that's always true, right? So once your stress is better, your breathing's better, doesn't always mean that your gut stuff clears up. But at least in my head, then I kind of know, all right, there's probably something else going on. They, probably need someone to take a more in-depth look at it too. And it's fascinating to me how some people will spend, just like you said, $3,000 to $5,000 on testing that may be useful, may not, but just spend even half of that on training and lifestyle and nutrition. It's like, that's way too expensive. I can't do that.
I think it does help in a sense too. look at almost like a systems approach. Like people who want these quick fixes, they don't realize whether it's like neuroendocrine or whether it's gut microbiota or whatever it is. You start to have this appreciation. There's a time course for changes to take place after a lifestyle gets put in place. But you know what I mean? These mechanisms, you don't just magically become lean or very strong or something like that. But this is these time courses differ, but it could be weeks or months. And you know, that's been our mantra for so many years, is that patience to let adaptations occur. But it is fun to look at these underlying mechanisms. I mean, you get this idea about the various time courses, I guess, and maybe that can counsel patients, you know, to not be so hasty and expect changes to happen so quickly, because you're trying to influence populations of this or that, or get certain endocrine changes, you know, things like that.
Yeah, I agree, and it's a little bit of a balancing act, because we want to balance trying to get someone healthy as quick as possible, but also not expecting the world to change in a few days, but then also realizing when a therapy is not working, right? Because the other part of that is, and you hear this sometimes again from well-intentioned but nutritional focused practitioners, that you just got to give the diet more time, and someone's 6 months in and they still feel kind of not even well, and it's purported to be a healing crisis or the layering effect, and I mean, I'm open to that being true if the right data were presented, but usually my BS meter goes off pretty severely when I hear that, and usually you should be seeing some kind of an effect within a couple weeks. And that effect could be, I'm feeling generally better, or I'm feeling generally worse. And of course, if you're feeling generally worse, then you need to change your tact. And if someone's feeling better, then the most important thing that I look for in what I counsel my patients on is, if we're moving in the right direction, let's maintain the course. Now, we may do things to enhance that, but don't potentially sacrifice progress for regression. And what I mean by that is, sometimes when people are feeling better, if you do nothing other than give them another month or two, they will continue to feel better. But sometimes if you try to do even more, someone has a negative reaction to that next layer of treatment, and now they're worse off than they were before. So it is important, and time is a factor for healing. So if you're someone who's grappling with some of this stuff and you're doing something that's working for you, don't be greedy. Don't expect the world to change over the course of 2 months. As long as you're making slow and steady improvement, then give something its chance to get you to, or discover where your peak level of improvement is. Because sometimes you'll get to that peak without doing anything additional other than just giving your body time to heal and recover and what have you.
Yeah, and that's very similar to training too. Like, once I find something that I know works for an individual for training and nutrition, I'm probably going to keep going down that path. And, sometimes their next program, they're like, whoa, but this looks a lot like my last program. Yeah, because the last one worked really well. Why would I, do something 180 degrees different? You're probably going to get a worse result. They're like, it goes back to what we talked about, the new and novel. It's that fine line between, I'm trying to balance more of their psychology of making it just new and novel enough that they're excited about it, they're interested, but yet, the adaptations that I'm trying to get are going to be along the same path. I'm not going to completely throw everything out and do something completely different.
Yeah, I used to have an endocrine prof, and his mantra throughout the entire semester, and I remember this after all these years, but was that if you push too hard, the body will balk. So you need to encourage things, whether it's fat loss or maybe in this case, modification of gut bacterial colonies or whatever it is. The bottom line is, I think so much of what you hear in the fitness industry it overlooks the fact that homeostasis ruins the day. You add in that extra, I could just make it a little bit better, and then you kind of you pass some tipping point, and then you end up worse. Like Dr. Ruscio was saying, like regressing in some way. It's like, oops. Yeah.
Yeah. Cool. So as we wrap up here, what would you say, just in general, is your kind of top 3 recommendations for people that are listening to this, or generally lifters, and maybe they haven't thought a lot about gut health? What would you kind of recommend, like your top 3 things to them?
Great question. And there's a couple of simple things people can do. The first would be 1 or 2 dietary experiments. You can try a diet that's low in allergens, and oftentimes the paleo diet is a good template for determining this. And if you've tried that and that hasn't worked well for you, you can try a low FODMAP diet. And this is a good diet if people do have bacterial overgrowths, or if they just have something like IBS or IBD, then this is a very well-studied diet that actually helps to prune back overgrowths of bacteria. So those are two dietary starts that can be very helpful.
What is a FODMAP for people listening who may not be familiar with that?
FODMAPs are just forms of carbohydrates that are very good at promoting bacterial growth. They stand for fermentable oligodimonosaccharides and polyols, which really means nothing to people. But so what it really means is that these are types of carbohydrates that are sometimes seemingly healthy, like asparagus, for example. But due to the carb structure of the carbs in the asparagus, they're very good at feeding bacteria. But if you're someone that already has a bacterial overgrowth and then you feed it, you can actually feel worse. And so by eating a low FODMAP diet, you focus on the fruits and the vegetables in your diet that aren't powerful at feeding bacteria, and in effect you tend to essentially starve those bacterial overgrowths, which can have a normalizing effect on the bacteria amongst other things, and then that can result in someone feeling better.
See, now that is fascinating, because so many bodybuilders will focus on eating almost nothing but chicken breasts and asparagus for weeks at a time.
Bro, it's healthy.
Yeah, right? Or like to get lean or whatnot. But yeah, that's very interesting.
Yeah, and it may be because when you go on this lower carb diet, oftentimes you focus on vegetables, and if you unintentionally select for the vegetables that are high in FODMAPs, you could definitely run into a problem pretty quickly. So the first, and then the other item would be considering experimenting with something known as intermittent fasting, which essentially just means skipping a meal. And some people, especially if their gut is in need of a chance to rest and recover, will do better if, for example, they skip breakfast and have a slightly larger lunch and dinner. And if you think about this from an evolutionary standpoint, we probably didn't, as hunter-gatherers, wake up first thing in the morning and have breakfast waiting outside for us. We probably underwent at least a few hours of moderate or lower level activity to procure foodstuffs before we could eat. And this fasting time does allow the gut a chance to run important healing and housekeeping functions. So if you're someone that's always kind of following the traditional bodybuilding mantra of a meal every 3 to 4 hours, you may want to experiment with and see if you do well if you skip a meal. And some people probably are already shaking their heads nodding their head in agreement or shaking their head in disagreement. If you're nodding your head saying, yeah, you know what, when I skip a meal, I'm less bloated, I feel better, then this may be a good approach for you. If you're shaking your head saying, no, that's not me, every time I skip a meal I get hangry, then it's probably not going to work well for you. But just don't feel pressured by the old bodybuilding dogma that you have to eat frequently, because there may be a different aspect to this of allowing gut health and gut healing. And sorry, not to be too long-winded, but to the question of does fasting impair your metabolism, we did a fairly comprehensive review of the literature on this. And what you see is either no discernible impact on metabolism, or the majority of the data showing a slight benefit on metabolism by fasting. So the old thinking that if you don't eat, you're going to go into a starvation response, and that starvation response is going to slow your metabolism. It's not really true unless you're undergoing a prolonged caloric deficit. But what most people will do when they do intermittent fasting, skipping breakfast, for example, is they'll auto-regulate to have more calories at lunch and at dinner.
Yeah. I'm a huge fan of intermittent fasting when it's done correctly, so I would agree with all those points.
And then secondly, if those things don't help, someone can try some simple gut supports. Vitamin D can be helpful. There's been a couple of clinical trials showing its benefit in IBS. Probiotics can be helpful, and there's different classes of probiotics. I would try a couple, and I know that's kind of vague, but see how you do. Also, something that can be helpful for people to experiment with is what's known as enteric-coated peppermint oil. And this may not necessarily fix the problem, but it can be kind of a palliative measure. And if people are constipated, they may want to try a fiber supplement. And I'd look for a predominantly soluble fiber, because there's two types of fiber, soluble and insoluble. And there's a higher incidence of negative side effects when you use a predominantly insoluble fiber. So I would shoot for at least 2/3 soluble to 1/3 insoluble. And that works best for those who are constipated. If you swing more toward diarrhea, fiber may irritate your gut and may not be a good idea. And then there's, third and finally, if none of those things work, then you may want to consider a more kind of targeted antimicrobial approach. And this is where certain herbal medicines can be very helpful, things like oregano, berberine, garlic, or even in some cases select targeted antibiotics that have been shown to treat things like small intestinal bacterial overgrowth. Herbal medicines, I think, work equally as well. And there's also finally special meal replacements known as elemental or semi-elemental diets, where someone does a short-term fast and only uses these meal replacement shakes that are very hypoallergenic and gut-friendly. And for the more severe cases, sometimes this is the only thing that produces results, but it can be quite powerful when you do get this therapy targeted to the right patient. So those are a few things. I know that's kind of a lot in a short period of time, but you can get a lot of benefit out of just working through those simple fundamentals.
Cool. No, that's awesome. Well, thank you very much for all your time and all the great knowledge here. If people want to get a hold of you or find out more about you, how can they do that?
My website's a great place to plug in, which is just drruscio.com, which is drruscio.com. We have a weekly podcast, a weekly video. We have if there's practitioners listening, we have a monthly clinical training newsletter for practitioners. And also I have a book coming out February 1st that will give people a personalized plan to walk through what I just kind of outlined. And it kind of walks you through step by step. We do a reassessment at the end of each step. And what I like about the way the book is laid out is there's a number of steps, but we reassess at the end of each step, so that if you're someone with a very mild case, you only have to do, let's say, 2 steps. But if you're someone with a really severe case, you may have to do 7 steps. So it's really personalized to you, so that someone, not everyone is doing the same thing, so that if you're an easy case, it's easy for you. You're in and out. If you're a more progressed case, then there's the additional resources there for you. And that should release February 1st, and the information for that will be available on our website also.
Cool. Awesome.
Yeah.
And if people want to visit you in person, you're in northern-ish California?
Yes, I'm outside of San Francisco. I have a clinical practice in Walnut Creek, which is near San Francisco, and that's where my clinic is located. We also do telemedicine visits for people via phone or Skype who aren't in our area, or even internationally if they're in need of help. So yeah, if you're someone who needs that one-on-one attention, you can certainly reach out to the office also.
Yeah, and I would recommend it if you're really messed up and nothing seems to be working. I would highly recommend it. I've been out there and sat in that very office, and it was extremely helpful. So,
yeah, we recorded a video, didn't we? I don't know.
Yeah, we got a couple of videos. I think I'll have to find them. They're around somewhere.
Cool.
Cool.
Right. Thanks for having me on, Mike. It was guys, it was a lot of fun.
Yeah, thank you very much, and I'll see you at Ancestral Health Society coming up in Seattle. So
looking forward to it.
Cool. Alrighty. Thank you very much.
See ya.
Thanks, guys.
Hey listeners, have you seen the store at IronRadio.org? There are 3 halls in the store. One for Phil, one for Fortress, and one for myself, Dr. Lowry, and they're thematic. So you can go into our Halls of Iron store and choose based on your goal. If you need something to learn or read or something nutritional, you can look in my store, Lonnie's store. If you want something about injury prevention or competition, then take a look at Phil's Hall of Iron. And if you want something about motivation or daily training, Fortress's Hall has what you're looking for. There are some fun, heroic descriptors as you browse through the store, so we try to make it a little more fun than the average boring online store. And whether you're a novice lifter or someone more experienced, you can take heart that you're not wasting your time. The things that we put in each Hall of Iron are actually based on our own recommendations. Protein powders that we know to be good, knee sleeves, wraps of some kind, things that Fortress uses in his own training. The stuff you see, you know is good. This way you don't waste time. So check out the Iron Radio store at ironradio.org and let us know what you think on the forums, and certainly you can request products and we will screen them before they go in. So thanks for listening. Iron Radio is accepting donations. If you like what we do, the professors, the scientists, the bodybuilding show promoters, the athletes themselves in powerlifting and bodybuilding, please consider making a donation or maybe buying something from the ironradio.org store. We also are accepting supporting members. So for $4 a month, which is frankly less than the bank sneaks out of your account in fees, you can step up and support a form of sort of public radio for the bodybuilding and powerlifting and strength community. The Iron Radio podcast and all of the audio on ironradio.org is for informational purposes only. If you're interested in starting a diet or exercise program, it's important to check with your physician. Also seek the help of registered dietitians, athletic trainers, and qualified exercise physiologists in order to make the progress that you need.